Yakuza 0 is an eccentric mix of dramatic storytelling, action, and humor. It combines radically different elements which seem like they should clash against each other, but which somehow work together to make the game greater than the sum of its parts. Depending on which games you count, and if you include spin-offs, Yakuza 0 is either the 6th or 11th game in the Yakuza franchise. The series has been developed by Sega since 2005 and is still going today. Despite being a later entry in the series, Yakuza 0 is the perfect starting point for newbies since it's a prequel and requires no knowledge of prior games. It was also the first game in the franchise to receive mainstream attention in the West. I think Yakuza 0 can at first unfairly appear as nothing more than a screwball comedy. The ridiculous antics and wacky moments lend themselves more easily to brief fan clips and marketing, rather than the overarching dramatic story which I consider to be the biggest draw of the game. The comedic snippets are what led me to initially dismiss it as a generic weirdo Japanese game in the vein of something like Saints Row. But while it does have those elements, Yakuza 0 is so much more than that. Despite the frequent gags and zany comedy, at its heart it's an action drama that tells a serious story with heavy subject matter like racism, human trafficking, physical disabilities, and homelessness. It might be hard to tell from my voice, in fact it may shock you, but I'm not an emotional person. Even so, I teared up during Yakuza 0's story. What makes the game so special, and one of my favorite games of all time, is its unique combination of story, characters, and gameplay elements, and just how much it has to offer. In this video, I'll be examining nearly every aspect of Yakuza 0. This is going to be an in-depth analysis, and I intend to cover many key details of the plot and game mechanics, so consider this your spoiler warning. I'll be examining the main story last, which I consider to be the emotional core of the game. This video's length may be daunting to you. I'll be moving briskly, but Yakuza 0 is a huge game with a ton of content. You can use the timecodes in the description to jump to different sections. My brief recommendation is that, while Yakuza 0 isn't perfect, it's an amazing game that's well worth your time and money. I think novelty plays a big factor in what makes the game special, so if at any point you see something that makes you interested in the game, I suggest you play it first before continuing this video. I'll still be here when you get back. The game starts off with Kazuma Kiryu, a low-ranking member of the Dojima family, beating up a salaryman on behalf of their loan shark. When the man later turns up dead, it seems that Kiryu is being framed. Kiryu then has to deal with demands to take the fall from the Dojima family's 3 lieutenants: Kuze, an old-school gangster who believes in the traditional Yakuza code; Awano, a playboy who deals in extortion; and Shibusawa, the soft-spoken one whom we don't get a good read on. But before Kiryu can get to that very serious business, it's time for a night on the town and partying! First we'll go sing karaoke, then hit the clubs and do some disco dancing, maybe bowling, play some blackjack, then swing by the mahjong parlor, race toy cards with the neighborhood kids, and win some stuffed animals on the claw machine. Yakuza 0 is a very serious and dramatic mafia story after all. Yakuza 0 is held up by 4 pillars of content: combat, minigames, side stories, and the main plot. Despite being separate experiences, these 4 pillars sometimes intermingle to encourage players to explore everything the game has to offer. Side stories can lead to minigames and combat, the main story incorporates fighting and sometimes tangents to introduce side activities, money earned from combat can be used to buy items for minigames, and so on. The game makes an effort to intertwine some of its different aspects and have one lead to another. The game's director described Yakuza as a garden with many activities on offer, though I describe it more as an amusement park. Hypothetically, you could ignore most side content and focus solely on the main story, but I think that would be doing yourself a disservice. The side stories and minigames are fun in and of themselves, and the wacky comedy complements the seriousness of the main story and its action set pieces. The amount of content Yakuza has on offer is staggering. On my first playthrough, I tried every minigame at least once and played a lot of them many times. I finished the main story, nearly every side mission, completed the big real estate and cabaret side content, and mostly upgraded the combat styles. Yet despite not 100%ing everything, I still put more than 100 hours into the game. On my second playthrough, which I did to experiment and record footage, despite knowing the optimal routes for progression, it still took me 71 hours to finish the game. The exact amount of time you can squeeze out of Yakuza 0 depends on how much you care about each activity it has on offer. While the game does gate some content behind story progression, it otherwise allows you the freedom to do whatever you want in whatever order and however much you want. The Yakuza games make a habit of recycling content from one game to another, especially when it comes to minigames, which I can imagine would make them less appealing to enfranchised players. When I played Yakuza 0's sequel, Yakuza Kiwami, I definitely felt less inclined to play minigames that had been recycled from 0. For me, Yakuza 0 was my first exposure to the franchise, so I didn't have any experience with previous titles, and thus everything felt fresh. I wanted to complete the main story, side missions, and minigames. When it came to minigames I didn't care for, I simply ignored them. Yakuza 0 continued to surprise me even when I thought it was done and had no more tricks to play. The game keeps introducing new minigames, mechanics, and characters 10, 20, 50 hours into the game, long after you think it already has a sufficient amount of content, far surpassing most other games, and that you've seen everything there is to see. Money is your primary resource in Yakuza 0. You acquire it mostly from combat encounters, but also from completing main story chapters, some minigames, especially gambling, selling items, and from engaging with Yakuza's sizable real estate and cabaret side content. Money can be spent on practically everything: weapons, equipment, healing items, various collectibles, and most importantly, upgrading your character's combat abilities. It helps tie various things together. For example, money earned from combat can be spent on items related to minigames. The other type of currency are completion points. They're acquired via various activities related to, as their name suggests, completionism. Basically, doing anything and everything in the game, from walking, running, traveling by taxi, defeating enemies, finishing well in minigames, eating at restaurants, and so on. Completion points can be spent on upgrading your character in different ways than money, mostly related to navigation and activities in the overworld, as well as the two big real estate and cabaret businesses, which I'll cover later. The game has a quote-unquote open world, but it's not like the kind you typically see in something like GTA or Breath of the Wild. The game takes place in the fictional cities of Kamurocho and Sotenbori, which, while fictional, are heavily influenced by real locations in Japan. The playable areas are relatively small slices of what look like much larger city environments and are ensconced by invisible walls. It only takes a few minutes to run from one side of the map to the other, and there are many fast travel points in the form of taxis sprinkled along the border. This is fine, however, as Yakuza 0 isn't an exploration-based game. The cities simply serve as hubs to contain all of the game's attractions. Over the course of the game, you'll get very familiar with the city's layouts, as you run the same routes over and over, going from minigame to story event to side mission, and so on. Many open-world games are obsessed with creating a huge map without regard for what activities you can actually do. They wind up having large swaths of empty areas with points of interest nested in between. Yakuza having a huge map would only make travel between relevant areas tedious, something I think many open-world games suffer from. While the game occasionally nudges you into doing side content, sometimes coming to a complete stop to do so, for the most part it doesn't force you to participate in side activities and you can progress the main story without having to grind for money or upgrades. Littered throughout Yakuza's maps are various restaurants which the player can eat at and restore their health. I didn't think much of them on my first playthrough, but I learned afterwards that they're actually real brand name restaurants in Japan. I wonder if I would have viewed the game differently if I'd been running around a city full of Starbucks and Subways, healing by drinking lattes and eating sandwiches. The conclusion I've come to is that I don't think it matters. Yakuza 0 may be the only game I've played where product placement didn't bother me. It's unobtrusive and, like the rest of the side content, you never have to visit any of the restaurants. They feel like natural inclusions in the world, and they're never shoved in your face or otherwise detract from the story or setting. In many ways, Yakuza 0's design feels oddly dated. It doesn't autosave, and you can't save from the menu, instead needing to run to phone booths dotted throughout the map. The phone booths also contain an item box where you can store excess items you don't have enough room for in your inventory. I understand why you can't hold infinite weapons or healing items, but there's no reason to limit your supply of Crane Game plushies, and there are even separate, unrestricted inventories for things like toy car parts and crafting materials. Even though you don't have to, I wanted to acquire as many completion points as I could. A lot of them are received from doing things you'd be doing anyway, like walking, running, playing minigames, fighting enemies, etc. However, some activities you have to go out of your way to do. The worst in my opinion are the game's restaurants. The game awards 1 completion point for ordering everything on a menu, and there are 24 restaurants in the game. You can't eat if your health is full, and you can't drink if your alcohol meter is too high, although you can consume app stims and legendary drinkers to partially reset them. I think the developers intended for players to complete restaurants gradually over the course of the entire game. However, consuming healing items is a faster and more convenient means of replenishing health than visiting restaurants, which makes visiting them pointless for anything other than the completion points they award. What this means in practice is that the optimal way of completing restaurants is to enter, order 2 to 3 items, leave, consume multiple app stims or legendary drinkers to reset your hunger or alcohol, and repeat until the whole menu is checked off, waiting through 2 or more loading screens each time. This also means revisiting drugstores in between binging sessions to obtain more app stims and legendary drinkers. The whole thing is incredibly tedious. You can acquire the bottomless stomach skill from the completion point shrine, which allows you to eat as much as you want without using app stims, but it doesn't apply to alcohol and costs 6 completion points. Since there are 24 restaurants in the game and the skill has to be acquired separately for playable characters, it costs half as many points to acquire than what's paid out, just to have a skill that makes the process less tedious. The whole thing feels like a waste of time. Completionism is fun when the activities you're completing are entertaining in and of themselves, not when they're a checklist. Now, you don't technically have to do any of this, but some of the skills you can get from the completion point shrine are very much worthwhile, letting you run before tiring, which in my opinion should have been granted by default, getting more money from defeating enemies, and bonuses for each character's business later on. I also dislike how the completion point menus are laid out as linear lists rather than branching ones. For example, I wanted the increased dashing skills but didn't care about the ones that modify scattering money, but I had to buy them anyway. I wish they'd been separated and that you could buy whatever you wanted. Yakuza 0's base gameplay experience is beat-em-up brawling. You'll encounter recurring street fights against punks, thugs, gangsters, and rich businessmen, though you never have to fight them and you can always run away. Other times you engage in fighting are during occasional story-based enemy gauntlets, boss fights, and a few other circumstances. Combat consists of attacking with punches, kicks, and grabs, blocking, and dodging. It's further broken up by 3 different and distinct fighting styles that can be switched between and differ based on which character you're playing. The normal, middle-of-the-road fighting styles of Brawler or Thug, signified by a blue aura, the quick and light but less damaging styles of Rush or Breaker, signified by a pink aura, and the slower but more powerful styles of Beast or Slugger, signified by a yellow aura. Each style has its merits and they're mostly well balanced. I found myself switching between Kiryu styles throughout the game and never settled on a preferred one. The same can't be said for Majima's Breaker and Slugger styles. Breaker is very quick and you can spam attacks uninterrupted, which is great for dealing with multiple weak enemies, i.e. most of the fights you'll have during the game. Frankly, the Breaker style is overpowered. The lower damage per hit is more than offset by how fast the attacks are, and it even works during boss fights. In contrast, the Slugger style felt unwieldy. I mostly stuck to Breaker unless the situation called for higher damage or more responsiveness, in which case I switched to Thug or Slugger. Aside from that, the combat styles were fun to use and felt good. Each combat style has an associated upgrade wheel where new moves and stat enhancements can be purchased with money. Fighting trainer Baka states that money can literally be used to improve yourself. I like to imagine Kiryu stuffing handfuls of cash down his throat and somehow becoming more powerful as a result. The game also has something called heat actions. Successful strikes and dodges will fill the heat gauge, while remaining passive or getting hit will lower it. Once full, you can perform a heat action, which is a special cinematic attack that usually does more damage. Doing so depletes the heat gauge, while having a high heat gauge increases your speed and power. So fights become a balance between using high damage heat actions and maintaining a high heat bar for greater speed and damage. Heat actions also can't be blocked by enemies, including bosses. The heat actions themselves are flashy animated moves and are often context sensitive. There are over 110 unique heat actions, some very niche. Most are viscerally exciting, and there are enough of them to maintain the novelty. Something Yakuza excels at is presentation and its sense of style and flair. The characters and fights are flashy, flamboyant, and over the top, and story sections can be quite cinematic and gripping. More on that later. There are a multitude of weapons to use that augment combat. They tend to deal a lot more damage than bare-knuckle brawling and have their own heat moves. Unfortunately, they have very limited uses and often cost a lot. While I did sometimes use weapons, I didn't rely on them and almost never purchased new ones. I felt similarly about equipment. As I said earlier, random street fights are sometimes supplemented by story-based enemy gauntlets, wherein you have to fight through waves of enemies, sometimes before reaching a boss. These play out in essentially the same way as normal street fights, except there are more enemies to fight at once and the prolonged battles wear away at your healing items. I generally like them except for these bullshit chair guys. It's hard to dodge or block their attacks, and you can't attack them without being near enough for them to attack you. They only appear as part of occasional story-based enemy gauntlets, never as normal foes, so there aren't many opportunities to practice on them. I never got the hang of fighting them and would just eat damage unless I happened to have a ranged weapon at the time. Boss fights are one-on-one battles against much more powerful than normal enemies and are tied to the main story. They have unique attacks and movesets and were generally fun and satisfying to fight. Special moves for each style can be unlocked by training with various fighting gurus such as Bacchus, which are separate from the regular upgrade paths. Like most things in the game, unlocking them is optional, and because of deficiencies in the combat system I'll speak about later, they're unnecessary and often tedious. Kamoji, the trainer for Kiryu's Rush style, has a series of timed challenges where the player has to dodge or block an opponent but not attack them. This is fine in concept, but the 1-minute time limit is way too long and the challenges do little to differentiate themselves from each other. Fei Hu trains Majima's slugger style by outfitting you with various different weapons. This was a great idea, as forcing you to use different weapons introduces them to the player and gets them curious about the game's weapon system. Except that's a lie. Fei Hu is the one using different weapons while you're stuck using the same slugger style for 5 separate fights, and it winds up being incredibly boring. Miss Tatsu, the trainer for Kiryu's beast style, is the worst implementation of the trainers. She's in a small area separate from Kamurocho that can only be accessed via fast travel and thus a loading screen. An area with only one other activity to do in it, the fishing minigame, and thus little reason to visit it. Her challenges feel unwieldy and awkward, and she charges a lot of money to attempt them. While they're not particularly difficult, if you fail a challenge, you have to pay her to take it again. While every other trainer has only 5 moves to learn, Miss Tatsu has 10 training sessions and 5 jobs. You don't even use the new moves you unlock during her training. They're just given to you afterwards without explanation for what they are or how to use them. Because of the aforementioned reasons, she was the only trainer whose challenges I didn't complete on my first playthrough. A quasi-boss fight that takes place in the open world is Mr. Shakedown. If he catches you, he forces you to fight him, and if you lose, he steals all of your money. The money isn't gone though, as you can always challenge him to a rematch and retake it if you win. Mr. Shakedown can show up with more money than he took from you, and there are other ways to game the system to get bigger payouts from him. There are actually 4 different Mr. Shakedowns, and each one has a narrative that comically explains why they're shaking you down. For example, one of them wants the money to treat their baldness. It's small, but they were humorous and made me want to continue their storylines to find out what their motives were. I like Mr. Shakedown in concept, but the implementation is deeply flawed. He has a huge health pool and deals massive damage. Even just one hit is often enough to insta-kill you. The fighting and dodging mechanics can be a bit jank, which can lead to some moments where he beats you feeling like bullshit. It's especially frustrating when he knocks you down and then delivers a lethal follow-up attack while you're still stunned on the ground and can't respond. Early in the game, fighting Mr. Shakedown is tense, but his health and damage increase each time you fight him, and his moveset barely changes. So what you wind up with is an enemy with a ton of health who can kill you in one hit, which incentivizes fighting him slowly and cautiously. You'll be fighting him over and over, and his attacks never change. It can take 5 minutes or more just to deplete his health, during which time even one slip-up means instant defeat. By the late game, I'd fought him so many times I'd memorized all his moves, and the only times I lost were when I got impatient. What's worse is that fighting him is the best method of acquiring significant money, especially in the late game. You actually get so much money from beating him that it fundamentally breaks the game's resource system. Defeating him just a few times and then using the money you get to upgrade your abilities will actually over-level you and make most of the other fights in the game trivial. It's also possible to accidentally break Mr. Shakedown's payout system. He can show up with no money, which makes fighting him pointless. I think this happens if you steal all of his money while he's sleeping. In my first playthrough, I was fighting Mr. Shakedown as Majima and winning billions of yen each time, but he had no money when I encountered him as Kiryu, so upgrading each character became incredibly lopsided as I was overflowing with money as one and struggling with the other. There are 2 NPCs named Mr. Moneybags who let you pass money between Kiryu and Majima later in the game, but they only let you exchange a limited amount with each transaction, and they also charge a service fee. Additionally, Majima's Mr. Moneybags accepts far less than Kiryu's does. They also won't let you invest additional money until you pick up the first investment as the other character, and you can't freely swap between characters until very late in the game. As a result, I mostly ignored them. Very late into the game, as late as the 50-hour mark, Yakuza finally changes up the combat by introducing an underground coliseum where you can fight a variety of mini-bosses under special conditions. I appreciate the attempt to spice things up, but it's introduced so late in the game that you'll likely be bored of the combat by then, as I was. Different types of enemies and encounters should have been spread throughout the regular combat in the game, not funneled almost exclusively into coliseum battles and boss fights. But unfortunately, all of these mechanics are irrelevant because the healing system is fundamentally broken. Let me explain. There's no reactivity, timing, or anything skill-based needed to heal. Healing is done by pausing the game, bringing up the inventory, and using a healing item. You don't have to time it, you just pause the game at any point during a fight and heal. You can carry 20 items in your inventory, and full heals are cheap, even at the beginning of the game. Here I am buying nearly a full inventory's worth of healing items within the first hour of gameplay. So you would have to suffer near lethal damage 20 times before your healing safety net comes loose. Even during my first playthrough of the game, there wasn't one single time where I came even close to losing a battle except for Mr. Shakedown. Story-based enemy gauntlets may have been designed to deplete your healing items before a boss fight, but they also include healing items along the way, and even that still wouldn't be enough. As a result, not even boss fights are challenging. The only time combat remains tense by the late game is when fighting Mr. Shakedown, and that's only because he can kill you in one hit, which negates the ability to heal. I wish the healing system had been designed differently, like how Dark Souls' Estus Flask works, where you have to carefully time your heals and they're far more limited. The broken healing system also covers up the flawed dodging and blocking, which are not at all quick or responsive and have to be performed well in advance of enemy attacks. Nowhere is this more evident than in certain encounters like some boss fights, when an enemy can perform multiple quick attacks in succession that break through dodges and blocks. But beyond that issue is a much bigger one that infests Yakuza 0's other mechanics as well, which is that many of its gameplay systems at first appear deep and complex, but are actually overly shallow and simplistic. Yakuza 0's combat initially looks very deep. There are tons of different moves, upgrades, items, 3 different combat styles for each character, different types of enemies, etc. But this complexity is undermined because most of the game can be beaten by button mashing and spamming the same basic attack patterns. You can invest in upgrades, new moves, items, and so on, but you don't need to. Many of the mid to late game upgrades are very niche moves that are so specific or marginal that they border on useless. When am I going to use a move that requires being drunk, or can only be used on the 3rd heat bar, or only applies when wielding brass knuckles, or can only be used on an enemy with a bladed weapon? And ultimately, none of it matters anyway because the healing system is broken. The combat system isn't as deep or well put together as what you might find in other games. It's clear to me that the other content in Yakuza 0, namely the minigames, sub-stories, and main plot, are carrying the weight, and that the combat alone would not have been enough to fill out the game. Now, I'm not saying Yakuza's combat system is bad. It can be fun, especially early on, but what it is more than anything else is serviceable, a simple, fun button masher. And that would have been fine if Yakuza 0 was a shorter game. But it's 100 hours long, and after that much time the combat starts to feel really stale and repetitive. Late into my first playthrough, maybe around 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the game, I switched the difficulty to easy because I just didn't care about the combat anymore and I wanted to get through it quicker. I was still enjoying the minigames, side stories, and main plot, but I no longer cared about combat. You can also switch to hard, which increases enemy speed, damage, and health, but I think this just makes the game more tedious and doesn't address fundamental flaws with the mechanics. I recommend others do the same. Play the game normally and, if the combat starts to get boring, change the difficulty and enjoy the game's many other attractions. Attractions like Yakuza 0 has a boatload of minigames. Some are great, some are a mixed bag, some depend on personal preference, and some are bad. It should be noted that every minigame requires money to play, and while most have trivial costs, some special modes are expensive. Karaoke and disco dancing are my personal favorites. Both are music-based rhythm games that require timing button presses to a song. Disco is slightly more complex in that you also have to move around a grid in addition to timing button presses. Both are pretty simple and fun, with a lot of visual flair and style, including fully rendered cutscenes for all of the karaoke songs. But what makes these minigames truly great is the fantastic music. It's incredibly fun to listen to, especially when Kiryu or Majima provide backup vocals for the female singers. Yakuza 0 has a fantastic, extensive soundtrack that includes rock, heavy metal, smooth jazz, pop, and disco. The karaoke and dancing songs are so good that I was convinced they must have been created by real bands and licensed for the game. But no, as far as I can determine, they were composed exclusively for the Yakuza series. My personal favorite is Times 3 Shine, although Rouge of Love is my favorite to play just to hear Majima's crazy interjections. I do wish there'd been more songs to choose from for karaoke and disco, but what's there already is great. In bowling, you control the spin speed, forward thrust, and angle of the ball, then release. The heavier the ball, the faster the targeting angle bounces from side to side, although even lighter balls are sufficient to knock down the pins. You can play solo or against an opponent, although I recommend only playing solo as the AI isn't very challenging and you have to wait during their turn. There are also challenges where the pins are set up in specific, hard-to-hit patterns. I was only able to complete about half of them, and the high entry fee dissuaded me from further attempts. Darts can be played solo or against an opponent. You're provided basic darts, although you can purchase better ones in the city for exorbitant prices. Unlike bowling, the AI opponent in darts takes their turn quickly and can be very challenging. If you're not familiar with the scoring system for darts beyond hit the bullseye, I think the game does a poor job explaining which areas are worth what. The actual meat of the game is trying to aim properly while your hand drifts. If you get drunk beforehand, the drift increases and your vision blurs. You pull back and flick the thumbstick forward to throw each dart, which is oddly satisfying. Pool functions as you'd expect. You pull back the cue with the thumbstick and release to strike the ball, although it's sometimes unresponsive. You can strike different points on the ball, not just the center, to affect its spin, although in practice I never saw a difference. You can play solo against an opponent or do a series of expensive challenges known as Puzzle Pool for cash prizes. The challenges very quickly ramp up and I could never get the hang of them. Unlike bowling, which has 10 challenges you can play in any order, Puzzle Pool progresses in a sequence, so if you get stuck on one, you can't see the remaining ones. Like the other paid challenge minigames, the cost is prohibitive, which is a shame because I'd like to have done all of them. By its nature, pool involves waiting for each ball to settle after being struck, but the waiting is exacerbated by the camera, which frustratingly lingers longer than necessary on the ball even after it stops moving. Still, I enjoyed my time playing pool and the jazz lounge atmosphere was relaxing. The baseball batting cages are surprisingly difficult and are segmented into a series of different difficulty levels. It's a combination of precision and timing as, like darts, the game jitters and pulls your aim, although with more force. Personally, I'm not a fan as the entry fees quickly balloon as you increase the difficulty and the item rewards you can get aren't particularly worthwhile. Additionally, you have to strike 20 balls without missing 3, which takes a long time and is very repetitive. The Gold Rush and Super Gold Rush challenge modes are also prohibitively expensive. Fishing acts pretty much as you'd expect. You can scatter bait to attract rarer fish, though there's nothing you can catch that's worthwhile. If you enjoy fishing, go nuts. Personally, I don't. In the arcade, you can play real Sega games Outrun and Space Harrier. There's also Fantasy Zone and Super Hang-On, but they're only unlocked by playing the former 2 games repeatedly. All of them were just okay. The arcade also contains a claw machine, which strangely has only 2 prongs. There are assorted toy knickknacks to acquire, more for completionism than anything else, as they're barely worth anything. Despite being a claw machine, which in real life are notorious for being designed to fail, Yakuza's is tricky, but there's still skill to succeeding, and it's surprisingly addictive. There are a number of traditional casino gambling games. There's Baccarat, Blackjack, Roulette, and Poker. They're the definition of your mileage may vary, as they're pure simulation games with no added gimmicks or features. Personally, I'm a fan of Texas Hold'em, but a big part of the appeal for me is the tension from risking real money and the social aspect of playing with friends, neither of which are in the game. And like the minigames before them, the money you can win isn't worth the time it takes to play them. As a comparison, here's me defeating an enemy and winning millions of yen in literally 3 seconds. These games are only worth playing if you enjoy them on their own merits. There are also a number of other gambling games which are Silo, Shohan, Koi Koi, Ochokabu, Mahjong, and Shogi. Not being familiar with any of these, their rules, special tiles, or unique Hanafuda cards, I found most of them very hard to understand. Mahjong in particular was incredibly difficult to approach, having 18 pages of rules. Silo and Shohan are dice games that are pure 100% random chance and thus hold no appeal for me. I didn't dabble in any of them beyond a few tries, but again, your mileage may vary. The telephone club is a weird one and strangely intricate. The premise is that you're on the phone with fellow telephone club members looking to arrange a date, essentially a pre-internet dating service. Though it sounds bizarre, there were actually real telephone clubs like this. The women on the other end ask you questions on a time limit and you're given a real answer alongside multiple joke answers. You choose by winding a rotary dial and firing rainbow musical notes, which is surprisingly tricky to time. The real answer itself is typically a cheesy one-liner. You go through multiple stages of progression while a blurred bikini-clad figure in the background is gradually revealed and poses suggestively. Combined with the joke answers and campy music, the whole thing is so ridiculous that it's funny. If you succeed in arranging a date, the game transitions out of the minigame and into side stories where you meet your date. There are 9 possible meetups, 6 of which end in failure and are played for laughs, with the other 3 being successes. While the minigame itself is fun enough, the way it integrates side stories is obnoxious. The 3 successful meetups are fine, but the other 6 suck, which I'll speak more about later when I cover side stories. I also didn't enjoy the fact that you can get repeats. Each background bikini color is assigned 3 of the 9 possible scenarios, and there's nothing else to indicate whether the woman you're talking to is one you've already met. So if you're trying to get one of the scenarios you haven't done yet, you'll have to play the telephone game more than 9 times, and each attempt will take you more than 3 minutes to play out. It's also possible to fail the successful scenarios and have to get them again. Once you achieve a successful meeting, you can then take that woman out on dates, which means you can invite them to play certain minigames with you. Strangely, if you lose, it counts as failing the date. Even though there are no rewards for doing so and the dates never lead to anything, I still enjoyed taking them out and revisiting minigames like karaoke. Pocket Circuit Racing involves racing miniature motorized cars around small model tracks. It's the minigame that's the most involved but also the most broken. Let me explain. Most of your decisions are made before the race itself. You customize your car with specific components that have different attributes. Once the race begins, the cars move along the track automatically. The only inputs you have are using a limited number of boosts which don't replenish, and stabilizing your car if it starts to derail. If your car is moving too quickly, either because you boosted it or it's simply moving too fast to begin with because of the components you chose, it'll start to wobble and fly off the track, which fails the race. You can button mash to stabilize the car, but like boosting, it's limited. So you'd think that the skill in this minigame would come from choosing the right balance of components, knowing when to boost and when to stabilize, and that technically is the case, but the problem is that nearly every mechanic is either not explained properly or is wonky. First, the miniature components you buy are numerous and expensive. In fact, the miniature car parts are, when combined, the most expensive items in the game. They have to be unlocked, and certain ones are required for winning certain races. So you may have a race that you can't win because you either haven't unlocked the components you need or because you can't buy them yet, but the game doesn't tell you that. Next, boosting is actually hazardous. Boosting your car will often cause it to go too fast and fly off the track, which means in practice the only time you can boost is just before the finish line. This means your car has to have a base speed high enough on its own to win without boosting. The game doesn't properly communicate its rules or how each component affects your car, and there are hidden stats and interactions that you only learn through trial and error. You don't actually always have to stabilize your car when it starts to wobble, as it may still be stable enough on its own, nor do you always have to button mash, as only a few presses may be needed. But the game tells you the opposite, that you have to stabilize your car by mashing the button frantically. And that's partly true, as if you don't stabilize it and you're wrong, you lose the race immediately. The races themselves can take a long time, and though there's an option to speed them up, they still take a while. So you may have a 12-lap race where you prepare your car, proceed with the race, and then your car derails or runs out of steam on the last lap. Then, without knowing which of the numerous components in your car was responsible for the failure, you have to go back to the drawing board, change one or more of them, and try the race again, and you may fail again. You may not even currently have access to the parts you need. Things aren't as simple as choosing the highest power components available. First, each individual car component is assigned a certain value, and every race has restrictions on the max value allowed. Second, choosing the max power may mean your car is too fast and derails. There's also an element of randomness. I've done races where I read online guides to know the exact customization needed to win and still lost. So the minigame eventually boils down to repeated trial and error, methodical testing as you tediously attempt the same time-consuming races over and over with no real feedback for what you should be doing differently. Still, there's a certain childlike joy in racing the miniature cars. There's a series of ongoing, serialized side stories connected to the minigame involving multiple characters, which is actually interesting and the only thing that salvages it. There were times I enjoyed pocket racing, but I was mostly frustrated. Catfight Club is a waste of a minigame. It's initially presented as a sexy fighting/gambling game a la Foxy Boxing. The rules explain that you have to carefully choose fighters based not only on their stats but also on their records, the idea being you could choose a less skilled fighter but win more because of the odds. Once in a match, you're presented with a literal rock-paper-scissors system where each fighter has different probabilities of which one they'll choose, and tasked with button mashing in the event of a tie. The problem is that this minigame is almost totally, completely, 100% random. It barely matters whether you choose rock, paper, or scissors, and in the event of a tie, how much you button mash doesn't affect the outcome at all. The game's assertions regarding fighters and their probabilities are bullshit. Just choose Jennifer since she has the best stats. It's a shame because it could have worked and there was clearly a ton of effort put into modeling the characters and animating the fights. It's also the only gambling minigame that has an actually worthwhile amount of money as a reward for winning. As is, it feels like a minigame lacking solid implementation of ideas, which uses sex appeal as a crutch for its shortcomings. The Dragon and Tiger weapons shop has an equipment search minigame and a crafting system that are also complete wastes of time. The idea is that you spend money on agents who travel the world and bring back valuable weapons, which is fine, but the execution sucks. First, as I said earlier, weapons are not a useful part of combat. They break quickly and you can't rely on them. Secondly, the items you can obtain generally aren't worth the money you pay to get them. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. Third, which items you get from your dispatched agents are randomized, so you never know what you're going to get. You can pay them more money to increase the odds, but you're still not guaranteed to get what you want, and the amount you need to pay becomes absurd. Fourth, the crafting system is worthless. Being a Majima exclusive activity, I think it's meant to mirror the collectible aspect of Kiryu's pocket racing. Unfortunately, you can't craft most items you haven't found, and some base ingredients fetch a high price, so in practice you're better off just selling everything and not bothering with it. And finally, you have to wait while the agent is dispatched. You don't get the items immediately. You can pay more to speed them up, but you still have to wait. Lastly, there are two other side activities which I don't classify as minigames. Scattered around Yakuza 0's cities are collectible telephone cards which feature photos of real JAV actresses. There are 3 cards per actress, an A, B, and C card, and 90 cards total to collect. This seems to be something added to make the extensive travel time around Yakuza's small maps less tedious by introducing an additional collectible task. It's mostly fine but has 2 failings. The first is that early on, you can get a radar from the shrine that will audibly alert you when there's a nearby card to find, but it takes up an equipment slot, which means you're effectively down 1 equipment slot for the rest of the game since you never want to remove it in case you miss a card. The second and more problematic issue is that all of the cards aren't immediately available. Being divided into sequential A, B, and C cards, new cards only spawn after you find the previous one in the collection, meaning you can run past the same areas multiple times before a new card appears. There are also many areas in the game that cards spawn but which you have no reason to visit or return to, such as restaurants, locations for minigames you don't care about, etc. I wish the radar hadn't taken a slot and that every card was available from the outset. There's also an NPC who will reward you with cash if you find all 3 A, B, and C cards for a given actress. Frustratingly, the game doesn't mark which ones you've already shown them, which is especially annoying if you revisit this character throughout your playthrough and don't remember. Finally, Yakuza 0 features the erotic video store Gandara, where you can pay to watch live-action softcore videos of real JAV actresses. New videos unlock as you play the game and meet their associated NPCs. That might sound exciting, but it really isn't. The videos are extremely tame, to the point where I can even show them here uncensored. They feature such titillating content as women in swimsuits taking bubble baths or surrounded by balloons. Scandalous! I don't get the point. In the age of the internet, when you have an ocean of freely and easily accessible sexual content at your fingertips, I don't see why you'd ever engage with this. If I want to watch sexy videos, I'll go do that. Right now, I'm playing Yakuza 0 presumably because I want to play a game. If there'd been some sort of gameplay similar to the Telephone Club, maybe it would have been worthwhile. As is, it's a waste of time. Like many activities in the game, there's completion points to acquire from watching the different videos. And like the restaurants, this is incredibly tedious as, even though you can skip them, you still have to wait through loading screens, entering and exiting the video store over and over. And like the telephone card NPC, the game doesn't mark which videos you've already played. I find the game not marking these types of things baffling since it does mark other things like restaurant menus and bowling challenges. For me, I took physical pen and paper, drew a grid, and checked off every video I selected. There are also 2 other huge business minigames which I'll speak more about later. Yakuza 0's side stories are largely well written, funny, and endearing. Doing them awards you with completion points, but they're entertaining enough on their own. The side stories are scattered around Kamurocho and Sotenbori, with more gradually unlocking as you progress. They're mostly self-contained, one-off stories, although there are ongoing ones as well as sequels to previous stories. Many of the side stories connect to NPCs in the overworld, include minigames, or include combat sections. The side stories are mostly comedic in nature and provide a nice complement to the main story's seriousness. However, not all of them are comedic, with some playing out as dramas. For example, Man with a Stranger's Face involves a man who intentionally abandons his family to keep them from danger since violent criminals are after him, and it's played 100% straight. There are a few cute fanservice side stories that call back to other Yakuza games or include younger versions of characters from them, specifically The Visionary Fortune Teller, Heir to the Family, A Shining Example, and Rise of the Dragon. At the time, I didn't know any of these were references to the other games, but they still work as their own standalone stories. The side stories are divided between Kiryu and Majima, with Kiryu having slightly more. I think Kiryu's somewhat dumb, wholesome, and innocent personality works better than Majima's as a sort of friendly neighborhood helper, willing to get involved with all manner of wacky shenanigans. I felt Kiryu's side stories tended to be stronger, especially the early ones. Majima's tend more towards being serious or just weird, though both have an abundance of good comedic adventures. There are roughly 60 side stories for Kiryu and 40 for Majima for a total of 100. However, that's only technically speaking, as I think some of them shouldn't count towards that total due to a lack of content and were probably arbitrarily counted to equal that satisfying total of 100. Additionally, many of the side stories aren't worthwhile. Now, I can't analyze all 100 individual side stories, is what I should probably say, but no, I'm going through all of them, so buckle up. Before continuing, I want to state up front that I'm a big fan of the stories and enjoyed them a great deal despite the amount of griping I'm about to do. Additionally, you don't have to complete any of them. First, the radio show postcard quests are counted as a total of 6, 3 each for Kiryu and Majima, but the first 2 of each aren't substantial enough on their own. I think they should have been grouped together as one story each. The same goes for the disco dancing challenges, bringing the total number of actual side stories to 92, although many others could be contested as well. However, even if you count all 100, only about 64 of them are actually worthwhile. When I initially looked back on the game, I remembered the overwhelming majority of the side stories fondly, but categorizing them now, I was surprised to realize that only somewhere between 64 to 70% of the side stories are actually worth your time, although this is still a lot given how many of them there are. The duds fail for a number of different reasons. Some are recycled content, copy and pasted ideas from other side stories. These include the radio show postcard stories, disco dancing challenges, Mr. Moneybags, Mr. Libido, and arcade attendants Kyoko and Luca. For example, Kyoko and Luca's stories play out exactly the same way. Either Kiryu or Majima meets them and then has to play an arcade game multiple times, the women say something which gets misconstrued as a proposition, only for it to be subverted when they reveal they were actually talking about installing a new arcade game. The only differences are their name and character model, whether Kiryu or Majima interacts with them, and which arcade games are involved, Outrun or Space Harrier. The narrative and dialogue play out the same way. Next are side stories that fail from either a lack of content or because the content that is there is bad. All of the combat style trainers are technically counted as sub-stories, but out of the 6 of them, I'd say only Bacchus has any sort of worthwhile narrative involving his past as a boxing coach who got involved with the Mafia. In general, they're just a boring series of tutorials. This is in contrast to the 4 Mr. Shakedowns who, even though their gameplay became tedious, had funny motivations for why they were fighting you. In Beyond the Door, you just show up to the Catfight Club and, after flashing some cash to the doorman, play the minigame. There's nothing more to it. I have no idea why this counts as a sub-story, especially since you're sent there as part of the main plot. In Calling the Future, you help a man make his 1980s cutting-edge portable phone work. It's ultimately just a series of fetch quests, but what makes this side story especially weird is the man's face never changes or shows any expression. In fact, he's the only character in the entire game who lacks facial animations. Even random combat NPCs have facial animations, which makes me wonder if the developers simply ran out of time. In Stygel's Barkeep, you act as a substitute bartender and answer customers' trivia questions about the drinks. If, like me, and I'm guessing 99% of players, you skip through the original bartender's dialogue when he was serving you, or just don't remember, all of your answers will be a crapshoot. But regardless of which answers you choose, there's nothing to this side story and it lacks comedy. The Telephone Club has 4 side stories where you either get stood up or hook up with a conventionally unattractive woman. I guess these are supposed to be funny, but they just felt mean-spirited, jokes at the expense of the women because of their appearance. The 10 million yen drug test seems like it was supposed to be a comedic adventure where a group of scientists' experimental enhancement pills are all duds with negative side effects, but it's not funny, it's just a series of pointless fights. In Gandhara's Clerk, the proprietor of the erotic video store says he's become desensitized from watching so many videos as part of his job, and he wants you to locate a supposed legendary erotic videotape, which you later receive from a seemingly supernatural woman in a white dress. There's no payoff as the tape fails to play, and the whole affair concludes on a weird, unsatisfying, lukewarm note. I have no idea what they were going for. Then there's the worst side stories of all, which fail because they require mandatory engagement with terrible aspects of Yakuza's gameplay systems, such as bad minigames or just literally mindless busywork. A lot of these are befriend a character side stories, where you have to repeatedly interact with the same character over and over to build their friendship meter. What this often means in practice is entering and exiting a location over and over and waiting through loading screens. For example, in Miho Convenience Store Clerk, the friendship meter increases by purchasing items from Miho at her convenience store. It doesn't matter how many items you buy or how expensive they are, the friendship meter increases only once per interaction. This means entering the store, waiting for it to load, buying something, exiting the store, waiting for it to load, and repeat. It's mindless, time-wasting busywork. Other sub-stories that fall into this category are the previously discussed Telephone Club ones, the 2 seafood chefs at Komian and Sushi Jin, Stygel's Barkeep, and the 2 Mr. Libidos. Speaking of, a contender for worst sub-story in the game is Sushi Jin's chef. In this story, the young waitstaff at a sushi restaurant tries to learn how to cook and make the hard-to-please chef proud of her. You might be thinking that story doesn't sound so bad, but the problem is it involves Yakuza's fishing minigame. In order to complete the story, you'll need to catch a turtle, an eel, and a salmon. In order to catch them, you'll need to buy bait and the peerless pole, which costs 30 million yen. Some of them are found in different locations from each other, and some require you to fish in specific spots. The exact spots you need to fish at aren't communicated to you, so it's possible to waste time fishing in an area where it's impossible to catch what you need. Even if you somehow know where to go or just choose correctly by chance, it still takes a long time as which fish take your bait is largely random. In my playthrough, it took an hour and a half to catch all 3. While most of the pocket racing related sub-stories are good, the final one, The Fighter's Crown, doesn't work because the race is pure bullshit. It requires incredibly specific car customization to be fast enough, but not so fast that your car flies off the track, and there's also randomness. Even following online guides, it still took multiple attempts to win. Another contender for worst sub-story in the game is Mystery Caller. An unknown individual contacts you through a phone booth and wants you to obtain a variety of weapons for him, each of which he'll pay you for. This means going to the Dragon and Tiger weapons shop and waiting for equipment searches to complete multiple times. You can see here I pay over 10 million yen to increase the odds of obtaining a Chinese broadsword to 99% and I still don't get it, and this happened 3 times in a row. The amount of money the mystery caller pays you is never even close to what you pay to get the weapons he requests. Then there's the narrative aspect of the story. The whole time, the motivator for me was finding out who the mystery caller was and why he was having Majima participate in these weird activities. Well, spoiler, you never find out. Instead, he sends a nameless woman to work as a hostess for you. She's terrified he's going to kill her, which made me feel gross, like I was participating in human trafficking. Lastly, there's the Soamon and Joamon secret boss fights that you get access to by completing every other sub-story in the game. They fail because they're basically just bad combat encounters and not stories. They have 14 health bars and multiple rapid, uncounterable attacks. I got sick of the fight almost immediately and quit. But even though around a third of the side stories are bad, they still felt like the exceptions to me. The majority of the side stories were great and I enjoyed them a lot. A few that stood out in particular were teaching a dominatrix to be more commanding, coming up with cool backstories for a group of amateur rock stars, and pretending to be a girl's boyfriend so her dad wouldn't learn she lied about being single. To give an example of how creative and insane some of these sub-stories can get, in Passport to Pizza, Kiryu mistakes an immigrant woman's pleas for a passport as her asking for pizza. You then have to order and race the pizza back to her in a time limit before it gets cold. Then the woman's pimp arrives and you beat him up only for him to proclaim his love for her and they agree to get married. And this mission was paid product placement from a real pizza restaurant. One story that stood out in a bizarre way was the Bowling Alley Turkey Challenge. This story is connected to real estate management, which I'll speak about shortly. After winning a bowling challenge with the promise of a roast turkey prize, Kiryu is mistakenly presented with a live chicken, which he decides to keep and appoint as a manager at his real estate company. It feels like the game is breaking some fundamental rule about how wacky the side stories can get, crossing a line into being too bizarre. On the other hand, it's hilarious. My take is to not worry about it. Before moving on, I'd like to discuss an oddity of the Yakuza franchise. Many of the female NPCs you meet in the city, side stories, and minigames are actually modeled from, named after, and sometimes voice acted by real JAV actresses. So you'll have characters that are fictional with made-up personalities despite looking like, sounding like, and being named after their actors. Imagine if a GTA game had a character named Nina Hartley who looked like and was even voiced by her but who was otherwise a random character like a grocery store clerk. It's an oddity and I'm not sure what to make of it. My guess is the game's sexual content is a form of marketing. Yakuza, with its focus on muscular male leads and violent action, is clearly targeting young men as its primary demographic. It personally did nothing for me, but I don't dislike it either, it's just strange. Two massive pieces of side content that remove the mini from Minigame are Real Estate Royale and Cabaret Club Czar. They each serve respectively as side diversions and means of accruing large amounts of money for Kiryu and Majima. They're not like bowling or karaoke where you can pop in, do a few rounds, and leave. They're massive, ongoing side projects with their own storylines and unique cast of characters. As you complete them, you unlock new expensive moves and upgrades for the characters' combat styles, which makes no sense to me. How exactly does acquiring real estate properties have anything to do with learning new fighting moves? It would have made more sense if unlocking abilities were tied to the combat trainers. Oh, whatever. Fully completing either side project unlocks a secret combat style for the respective playable character. While neat, by the time you finish one, the game is likely almost over anyway. Additionally, by the time it's unlocked, you've likely already upgraded the other combat styles, which means this new, legendary style starts off weaker than your other ones. Kiryu's Dragon of Dojima felt a bit awkward to me, not quite brawler and not quite rush. I tried it out, but it never felt as good to me as just sticking with the brawler style, the one it's closest to. Majima's secret style, on the other hand, felt overpowered. You can chain quick, high-damage knife attacks together multiple times and bust through ranks of enemies, though, like Dragon of Dojima, it feels a bit awkward to use. Both secret styles feel like pseudo-combinations of two of the other styles. They're a sort of mix of the normal and quick-speed blue and pink styles, incorporating some similar moves. Both Real Estate Royale and Cabaret Club Czar unfortunately suffer from Yakuza's repeated problem of initially appearing complex and interesting, but actually being shallow and tedious. Let's start with Real Estate Royale. In Real Estate Royale, you serve as an up-and-coming property tycoon meant to buy, maintain, and upgrade various locations around Kamurocho. You buy properties throughout the city and then hire managers, security, and pay advisors to upgrade them. The various staffing, maintenance, and upgrade costs are a lot, but so are your collection payouts. Many NPCs you meet and befriend in the game's side stories can be found and hired outside Kiryu's real estate office to serve as managers, security, and advisors. It's a neat way to tie the side stories into something bigger. Unfortunately, these mechanics are much shallower than they first appear. Each employee hypothetically has a diverse set of stats to weigh, but in practice, you don't have to worry about it. Advisors have a type of property they specialize in which is straightforward and there's nothing to balance. Managers and security can get tired, which disables collection or lets the property be taken over, but you can just substitute them out whenever they get tired, which is rarely. Making collections and property upgrades are incredibly tedious chores. You walk into your office, which requires going through a loading screen, interact with the real estate management system, make all your collections and slightly upgrade every unfinished property a single time, since once is the limit, and then set all districts to collection mode again. Then go through another loading screen when you exit the office and wait for collections to become available. There's no gameplay here, it's simply a matter of waiting, wasting time by fucking around with Yakuza's other content and returning to the real estate office over and over. The whole thing feels far too long. Real estate management is introduced in Chapter 5 and depending on how single-minded you are, can last for the rest of the entire game. I wish you could have managed things from the regular menu or just automated it. And then there's the process of actually finding and buying new properties, which sucks and is perhaps the worst part of the entire game. The properties you can buy are arbitrary locations spread throughout Kamurocho. There's no way to differentiate between what's a property you can buy and what's just a part of the city's background scenery. This means locating them involves going literally everywhere, rubbing up against every single wall, door, and storefront. They're easy to miss too. The properties get exponentially more expensive and many cost an obscene amount to buy, so you may not be able to purchase one even if you find it. For me, I got tired of searching for them, took physical pen and paper, copied the map, and crossed each building off as I checked them. I still wound up missing some and finally just said fuck it and looked them up online. It's my belief that if a video game requires you to take out physical pen and paper or look up online guides, the game has failed. Then there's the narrative aspect. In Real Estate Royale, you go up against competing real estate moguls known as the 5 billionaires. Once you acquire and upgrade enough properties, that area's resident billionaire will challenge you to a minigame and later a boss fight, with the winner receiving control of the loser's properties. The idea that a real estate billionaire would cede their ownership based on who wins a disco dance-off is nonsense, but let's ignore that for now. Challenging you to a minigame is fine if it's one you have experience with. If not, it comes across as unfair. For example, I didn't care much for the Sega arcade games, but the Electronics King still forced me into playing Outrun, tens of hours after I tried it. Thank God none of them challenge you to Mahjong. Each of the billionaires you compete against are portrayed as total scumbags. For example, the Pleasure King openly discusses coercing the women who work for them and disposing of them when they're no longer useful. The Media King kidnaps and threatens your secretary. Every one of the 5 billionaires could be charged with attempted murder for trying to kill Kiryu multiple times. Yet despite this, every one of them will join you after you defeat them in what I think was supposed to be a redemption arc, but it falls flat because their characters are so morally despicable. Their sins are simply glossed over to make room for the next antagonist. Real Estate's goal of being a moneymaker doesn't even work because fighting Mr. Shakedown is simply a more efficient method. Overall, the real estate management is a pretty big letdown. It's a shallow, tedious, time-consuming smattering of busy work and a narrative disappointment. The only positive about it is that it's connected to a few other side stories that are actually worthwhile, such as Help Wanted and The Tax Lady. Like real estate management, the Cabaret Club shares some of the same problems. It looks complex but is actually shallow and it gets old because it goes on for too long. However, it's way better than real estate management and it's an actual game, albeit one that looks mobile or browser-based. Majima takes over as the manager of the failing hostess club Sunshine and is tasked with improving its reputation and revenue. For those not in the know, a hostess club is basically an incredibly sad brothel where lonely men pay just to talk to women. Customers come in and you match them with hostesses they'll like. Unlike with real estate managers, the stats of the hostesses actually matter, though it's still an overly simplistic system. Like real estate, you can partner with properties to increase the club's fans, which means more running around, rubbing up against walls, although it's slightly more tolerable because Sotenbori has more straight layouts and the properties cost a lot less. The Cabaret returns far less revenue than real estate, making it even more of a joke next to Mr. Shakedown's game-breaking financial payouts. Hostesses can be upgraded and their stats improved by buying them new clothes and accessories. For a game allegedly tailored to young men who enjoy blood-pumping action and macho street thugs, I find it amusing that Yakuza 0 essentially has a pretty princess dress-up minigame. While it is possible to improve their stats via outfits, it mostly doesn't matter. Certain areas or club challenges might incentivize hostesses with specific stats, but you can pretty much just use the ones with the highest stats even in these circumstances. It's also a shame that stat bonuses and cosmetics are linked, meaning if you like certain outfits but also want the best stats, you have to choose one or the other. You can recruit hostesses from random NPCs or, like real estate, from NPCs you met during the various side stories. You can also receive some from the completion point shrine. Hostesses are divided into different ranks, with the lowest being bronze, then silver, gold, and finally platinum. You can't change their ranks ever, no matter how much you level them up, which means bronze-ranked hostesses are basically useless, as well as most of the silver-ranked ones. Even in the early stages of the game, you can see I have enough gold hostesses to almost fill out the roster and only need to include one silver hostess. The moment you get another gold or platinum hostess, the silver ranks become useless as well. Like the 5 billionaires, you'll be facing off against 5 managers of different competing hostess clubs known as the 5 stars, and get challenged to club battles. The 5 stars are less memorable than the 5 billionaires, but this is made up for by the fantastic platinum hostesses. The entire storyline structure and characters are pretty blatantly copy-pasted from real estate. In this case, however, the redemption arcs and recruiting enemies works because, rather than recruiting the scumbag managers, you recruit the hostesses employed by them, which works far better than greedy capitalist real estate moguls turning a new leaf. The platinum hostesses have the highest stats and are the only ones you can do special training with. Special training means you have one-on-one conversations/coaching sessions where you have to select correct responses, or you take them on minigame-based dates like Kiryu's telephone club. Which answers are correct are a crapshoot. It's not clear what kind of answers the women are looking for. Do they want flirtatious, supportive, professional, sympathetic, consoling, honest, straightforward? It's like every woman I talk to is looking for different answers depending on their mood, changing from one woman to the next, not even consistent within their own individual preferences. You know what? This is the most realistic part of the game. Special training sessions can only be done once before you have to run the club minigame again. What this means is that it's likely you'll complete the entire Cabaret Club storyline before finishing all of the special training sessions. I often wanted to continue a hostess' storyline but couldn't before doing yet another minigame run-through. The minigame itself is fun enough, but like combat, it gets old. The timer shows 3 minutes, but there are frequent interruptions that pause it, so each run-through actually takes about 7 minutes. There are 6 platinum hostesses, and each has around 6 sessions, meaning you'll have to run the Cabaret minigame a minimum of 36 times, which calculates to around 250 minutes or 4 hours just doing this one minigame. Once you complete the narrative storyline and no longer care about money, the most efficient way to get through the minigame and onto special training quickly is to run the game with only one hostess and not intervene whatsoever so the timer runs out faster. The special training sessions also feel pandering. They're shot from a first-person perspective with the girls looking and speaking directly into the camera, i.e. Majima. Like many of the female NPCs in the game, the platinum hostesses are all modeled, named after, and voice acted by real JAV actresses. And by the end of each of their storylines, they all develop a crush on Majima, though it doesn't develop beyond that. While it can be tedious and goes on too long, I enjoyed the Cabaret side content, especially compared to real estate management. It's a fun digression, brimming with charm and likable characters. Right, so where were we? That's actually a question you may ask a lot depending on how much side content you do, and brings up the issue of pacing. You can potentially spend hours on minigames and side stories before going anywhere near the main plot, or you can stick to it exclusively. The game also includes narrated story recaps in between chapters that act like those you'd see in a weekly TV show. It was personally never a problem for me, but it can be easy to forget small details when you spend hours between story beats. Take the Empty Lot as an example. The story largely revolves around the various Yakuza factions' struggle for control over a barren patch of land known as the Empty Lot, wedged inside Kamurocho. There's a very lucrative real estate development project planned for the area, and this seemingly shabby plot of land is the only remaining property not controlled by the Dojima family, but its owner is yet to be located. If Dojima tries to move ahead with the project and the Empty Lot's owner later turns up to stake a legal claim on the land, it would stall the project and blow up the entire enterprise. Given how much time you might invest in side activities, it's easy to forget the details and look at characters throwing around billion-yen offers for the Empty Lot as ridiculous, but it does make sense. Also, after years of ingesting Hollywood crime thrillers, it's refreshing to see a story based around real estate and not the drug war. Surprisingly, the issue of Kiryu being framed for murder, though it never disappears entirely, goes largely unaddressed for most of the game, as the plot focuses instead on the struggle for control of the Empty Lot. Kazama is the Dojima family's captain and is currently imprisoned for operating an illegal gambling den. He's also the mentor and father figure of Kiryu and his sworn oath brother Nishiki, both of whom grew up in an orphanage Kazama owns and who joined the Yakuza against his wishes. Kazama worries that the huge financial windfall the Kamurocho revitalization project would bring would make the Dojima family too powerful and lead to a civil war within the Tojo clan. But being in prison, he can only work through his allies on the outside. These are details we don't find out until later in the game, much of them from third-party characters. In fact, except for a brief flashback, Kazama only appears in one scene in the entire game. I think it was a bold choice to have him be mostly off-screen, yet also be an incredibly important figure in the story, someone every other character describes as a living legend and whom Kiryu and Nishiki idolize. So we have different factions attempting to gain ownership of the empty lot, with the Dojima family and its lieutenants poised on one side and Kiryu and his allies on the other. But there are additional factions that also play a role in the story, and it doesn't fit neatly into a good guys and bad guys, red team versus blue team narrative, which brings me to the game's presentation. Yakuza 0's cutscenes are shown in 4 different styles. There are fully rendered cutscenes with voice acting. Then there's in-game cutscenes, still with voice acting. In-game cutscenes with no voice acting that have text crawls instead. And there are a few rare, stylized cinematics with visual filters and still images where the characters' mouths don't move but which do include voice acting. I'm guessing the different styles are due to budget restrictions, but they all still work. The evidence for why I think this is the fact that nearly all of the side stories don't include voice acting, the only exception being the Cabaret Club's special training. Many story-based games are happy to implement simple shot-reverse shot camera work in conversations, which usually feel static and boring. In Yakuza 0, there's a deliberate, thoughtful use of the camera and shot composition in the in-game cutscenes which keeps them interesting. After facing Kuze and being expelled from the Yakuza, Kiryu is approached by a mysterious real estate broker named Tachibana, who offers his organization's resources to him if Kiryu agrees to work for him. Kiryu initially declines because he doesn't know enough about Tachibana and thinks the offer is too good to be true. While he does eventually join Tachibana, Kiryu first spends some time investigating his organization, which turns out to be a somewhat shady group competing with the Yakuza and property acquisition. In a truly bizarre scene, Tachibana monologues about the nature of power and the extent of his current reach, waving his hand across a window and causing a blackout to occur in sync with his motion. Now at first, you might excuse this as a visual metaphor, something that's not meant to be taken literally, but the characters in the game react to and comment on it, including Kiryu. Tachibana even mentions that he's only able to maintain the blackout for 10 seconds, confirming that this event actually happens and isn't just symbolic. It makes absolutely no sense and is never brought up again. After 2 chapters playing as Kiryu, the game switches perspectives to Sotenbori and to secondary protagonist Majima. This is a pattern that repeats for the rest of the game. Every 2 chapters, the story changes point of view from one main character to the other. I've seen some people complain about this as they feel it doesn't give enough time to get invested in the story before switching characters, but I'm not one of them. Each 2-chapter run ends on a dramatic moment before switching, which creates tension and an emotional high point. As the game progresses, the chapters seem to speed up. Chapters 12 through 17 in particular feel a lot shorter than previous ones. While I think the later chapters are shorter, I also think they feel shorter because you've likely done most of the side content by that point, so there's fewer interruptions from the main story. Before continuing, I need to discuss story structure and pacing. Before we're introduced to Majima, the game takes a long time lingering on characters who are ultimately irrelevant and who never show up again. The game's story is filled with moments like this. It spends time on things which don't matter to the overall narrative and which could have been cut, including many digressions that force the player into doing side content. But at the same time, the relaxed pace gives scenes room to breathe and works to balance the more hectic moments of action. A hard rule in writing is that if a scene doesn't serve the overall story, no matter how good it is, it must go. If Yakuza 0 had been written as a movie and not a game, most of, if not all of these moments would undoubtedly have been cut. Kiryu's investigation of Tachibana is a great example. Tachibana convinces Kiryu to join him by revealing secretive information regarding his ties to Kazama, information he could have shared earlier. Kiryu goes off sleuthing for hours, and by extension so does the player, only to wind up back in essentially the same situation, having a conversation he could have had in the first place. There are a ton of characters with various motivations and secret alliances, as well as multiple ongoing mysteries and plot threads, and while the unconventional arrangement of scenes and lack of a traditional narrative structure makes the story completely unpredictable, which I regard as one mark of a great story, it also means it can feel bloated. In the end, what I'll say about it is this: many of the scenes could have been tightened up or cut, but I was never bored. The story, though it could have been refined, remained consistently compelling throughout the game's entire 100-hour run, which is quite an accomplishment. So back to Majima. Giving scenes room to breathe is certainly to the game's credit here. Majima's introduction is, and this isn't an exaggeration, the greatest character introduction of all time. It's brimming with style and is one of many standout scenes in the game. It's far too long to show here, but if you needed convincing to play Yakuza 0, just watch a clip of Majima's intro. Majima is a disgraced Yakuza who was imprisoned and tortured for a year after he planned and abandoned a hit job with his oath brother. He's now in the doghouse, as it were, his whereabouts monitored by Yakuza henchmen, and he's forbidden to leave the city. Majima is introduced as the suave manager of the Cabaret Grand, a lucrative nightclub considered to be the most popular in the city. I find it strange that the game includes this gigantic side story of cabaret management and it involves an entirely separate club from the Grand. There are even some brief interactions with characters exclusive to the Grand that seem like they're setting up something but which ultimately don't go anywhere. Maybe the writing team didn't want the side content to overlap with the main story since there are main story scenes that take place at the Grand, or maybe something was planned but got cut. Another oddity is that the owner of the competing Cabaret Odyssey stresses that cabarets like his and the Grand are different from cabaret clubs like Sunshine, without elaborating on how they're different, and as far as I can tell, there is no difference. Anyways, Majima's goal at the beginning of the story is to be officially allowed back into the ranks of the Yakuza by any means necessary. It's a motivation that I don't understand considering he endured a year of torture and lost his eye at their hands, and he seems to be doing well as manager of the Grand. But this isn't a flaw in the plot, I just don't personally see eye to eye with criminal ambition. Majima and Kiryu are both headstrong dreamers, but whereas Kiryu is more blunt, innocent, and straightforward, Majima is more slick, calculating, and has a bit of a crazy streak. This is even reflected in their combat styles. Kiryu's tend to be simple and blunt, whereas Majima's are flamboyant and acrobatic. Majima is approached by his boss Sagawa to do a hit job on a man named Makoto, whom Sagawa describes as a low-life scumbag pimp who exploits escorts, with the assurance that Majima will be reinstated as a Yakuza if he succeeds. And let me tell you, in a story full of cold-blooded murderers, Sagawa is the slimiest character we meet. Even though his goal is to have the hit job succeed, he still toys with Majima's emotions just because he can, trying to torment him by philosophizing on the nature of killing and how even getting rid of someone who deserves it will still leave a stain on your soul. Majima reluctantly goes along with it and starts investigating Makoto, but the people he talks to describe the man as practically a saint who's actually protecting women. Majima eventually tracks him down to a massage clinic where, after a brief fight, a separate group of Yakuza show up looking for Makoto, and we learn the man is actually named Lee, with Makoto in fact being his blind assistant. Lee is shot and left for dead while Majima decides to rescue Makoto from the Yakuza. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger with Majima contemplating killing her. However, this doesn't carry any tension because we in the audience know that there's no way he's going to kill her. We later learn that Makoto was the victim of sex trafficking, having been tricked by who she describes as a man with a bat tattoo and sold to the Korean mafia, before eventually being rescued by Lee. Her blindness is caused by emotional trauma. We don't find out until later that Makoto is unknowingly the owner of the empty lot via inheritance from her grandfather. What I find interesting is that Yakuza 0 is, I'd argue, Makoto's story more so than either Kiryu or Majima. She's the character all of the story's events revolve around, and, boldly, she's not introduced until potentially 20 hours or more into the game. So the Yakuza are now gunning for Kiryu since he's been meddling with their business and also because they're after Tachibana and his information regarding the empty lot's owner. Henchmen are searching the streets for Kiryu and he winds up in another boss fight with Kuze. It's an exciting rematch against the grizzled Yakuza and feels appropriately weighty. If the game had left their conflict at this fight, it would have been great. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Ridiculously, you fight Kuze a total of 5 times throughout the game. Now, let me be clear. These aren't just lazy copy-pasted battles. The locations are different, his moveset is slightly different each time, some are one-on-one fights and others include flunkies. Even the outfit Kuze is wearing is different. And there are many other boss fights with different characters, so it's not as though they detract from the rest of the game. From a design standpoint, it isn't lazy, but they still don't work narratively. Each battle after the second one was less exciting because I was fighting the same guy I'd already beaten. By the 5th time he fights Kiryu, it's not even clear why he's doing it. After dealing with Kuze, Kiryu encounters a Wano who suggests that Kiryu work for him and give up Tachibana, promising to reward him in exchange. When that doesn't work, he resorts to threats. Awano claims that his men are waiting outside and will gun Kiryu down if he turns his back on him. Kiryu replies that he makes his decisions based on what he hates, that he hates the idea of working for Awano and would rather be shot. Damn if those ain't words to live by. Of course, Kiryu survives this encounter, which leads me to think about the experience longtime fans of the Yakuza franchise have during these scenes. As a newcomer to the series, I didn't know the ultimate fate of Kiryu, Majima, or any other character, though of course I thought they'd most likely survive. I wonder if dramatic scenes where the tension is based on the safety of the main character worked for enfranchised players who already knew the outcome. I suppose that even if these scenes don't work on that axis, they probably still function as fan service, seeing familiar characters in dramatic situations. Nishiki arrives and hightails Kiryu out of the city. They stop in the middle of nowhere and Nishiki pulls a gun on him. But rather than a betrayal, Nishiki states his belief that Kiryu is doomed, that the Dejima family will have him tortured, and that he'd rather give Kiryu a quick death. It's a powerful, emotional scene that showcases brotherhood and empathy. I've seen good stories in games before, but Yakuza 0 has something special. It has humanity. There's an encampment of homeless people living in West Park. When Kiryu is on the run from the Yakuza, a homeless man he met earlier offers to let him stay in his shack. Tachibana's dealings involve him with the Chinese immigrants of the ghetto Little Asia, who are enemies of the Yakuza but who are too weak to oppose them. It's briefly mentioned that they once held more power, but the Yakuza slaughtered them. Tachibana himself is half Japanese and half Chinese, his family having been left behind in China after World War II. He suffered discrimination all throughout his childhood for being mixed race and eventually fled to Japan when he was 15. At some point, Tachibana got into an unspecified fight which left him severely injured. By the time Kiryu meets him, he has a prosthetic arm and requires regular dialysis treatments. It's the little details that make me fall in love with the story, and Yakuza 0 has plenty of them. The people we meet aren't glorified nor denigrated. The plight of the homeless and the poor immigrant are not resolved. The game doesn't preach at you and simply shows these people as they are, be they civilians, criminals, wealthy, poor, whomever. Yakuza 0 also gives a unique take on masculinity, albeit likely unintentional. Kiryu and Majima are definitely portrayed as idealized male figures, physically strong, stern-faced, muscular, and with excellent fighting technique, but the game also shows a lighter side to them. They smile, sing karaoke, dance, wear flamboyant outfits, and know how to relax and have a good time. They're not solely brooding tough guys. The game doesn't make fun of them or treat their behavior as a joke. I think more male characters in games, and media in general, could do with this sort of portrayal. It seems like the game doesn't have traditional arcs for its characters. Kiryu, Majima, and Makoto don't exactly change from who they are at the beginning of the story to who they are at the end. Rather, they've learned some lessons, their situations are improved, and they seem more confident, though they're still fundamentally the same people. Lee hatches a plan to murder a look-alike of Makoto so the Yakuza will think she's dead and stop hunting her. Majima rejects the plan and demands to know more about Lee since it's unbelievable to him that Lee's only a massage therapist. Lee says that he also used to work as a hitman. One night, after tangling with the Korean mafia, he chanced upon a group of their female captives and released them. Makoto, who was among them, couldn't escape or live on her own since she was blind, so Lee gave up his criminal life and vowed to take care of her and hunt down the man with the bat tattoo. I think basic human empathy would have been a straightforward, believable reason for Lee to do this, but the game needlessly overcomplicates the situation by having him state that he used to have a sick daughter who became blind and died. It's a personal connection that I think was unnecessary in Phase 1 in Yakuza's coincidence death spiral, which I'll speak more about later. Various events transpire and Makoto is captured by a separate faction known as the Nikyu Consortium. Sagawa finds out Majima has been lying to him about Makoto and spends the night beating him. And then Sagawa just lets him go. Now, let me ask you, does this make sense? Sagawa is a slimy, sociopathic tormentor who's been constantly threatening Majima about the consequences of betraying him. His mission is to kill Makoto, and Majima has just proven he's unwilling to do that and that he can't be trusted. Yet Sagawa lets him live when he has no reason to. It feels like the writer wrote themselves into a corner. Majima should be killed at this point, but the story needs him alive, so he just is. The story in general has forced moments, but in different ways, such as with Kiryu's next situation. Tachibana, his right-hand man Oda, and Kiryu travel to the Tojo clan's headquarters and negotiate for Kiryu's protection. Some diplomatic words are exchanged, but basically, Tachibana bribes the chairman with an exorbitant sum of money to ensure Kiryu's safety. But before they can leave, the Yakuza henchmen present force them to fight in a long combat gauntlet, which makes no sense since they just successfully negotiated Kiryu's safety. Kiryu gives one throwaway line about how it's the Yakuza way or something. I do think something needed to happen as a dramatic punctuation for the end of the scene, rather than have them simply walk out unscathed, but this is nonsense. It feels like the game is terrified of letting the player go too long without combat gameplay, so it contrives situations for it to happen whether it makes sense or not. But there's a larger problem of things being too convenient or contradictory. For example, Tachibana Real Estate is initially set up as being a possible adversary, possessing a score of hired muscle able to give the Yakuza a run for their money. Yet once Kiryu allies with them, in order to raise the stakes, suddenly the whole organization is just Tachibana and Oda. Kiryu and Oda head to Sotenbori to retrieve Makoto, and the player steps into the city as Kiryu for the first time. After 50 to 60 hours playing with the protagonists segregated in their own cities, it felt oddly out of place running around Sotenbori as Kiryu. Unfortunately, aside from the novelty, there's not much to do, as each character can't do the side stories of the other and the minigames are the same. You can't even encounter Mr. Shakedown when playing in the other city. The only activity of note is that Kiryu can go to the underground Coliseum, although your progress there isn't saved between characters. It's here that the game pulls an inexplicable stunt that I can't make heads or tails of. Oda is waiting on a phone call and tells Kiryu to explore the city in the meantime. The game forces you to stop progressing the story and go fuck around for no reason. I'm not sure if it's based on in-game time passing, visiting specific areas, or what, but the game comes to a dead stop while you aimlessly wander around and play minigames. There's no timer or any indication of when enough time has passed. What I do know is that I played 5 games of pool and that still didn't trigger the progress. Eventually, Oda will page you, but I have no idea why this time gate was put in the game. Oda and Kiryu retrieve Makoto and flee from Shibusawa's men in a high-speed car chase. Afterwards, Oda attempts to betray them, but he's thwarted and left injured. Kiryu presses him on his betrayal, and Oda reveals 2 things: that he's the man with the bat tattoo who tricked and sold Makoto to the Korean mafia, and that Makoto is actually Tachibana's sister. Despite greatly admiring Tachibana and being otherwise loyal to him, he feared Tachibana would kill him once he learned what Oda had done. With no other recourse, Oda agrees to stay behind and hold off Shibusawa's men while Kiryu and Makoto escape. Back in Kamurocho, Kiryu informs Tachibana of what happened, who tearfully recounts the story of how he left his family and determines to reunite with Makoto. They're interrupted by the Yakuza, and while fleeing Little Asia, Laogwei, an assassin hired by Dojima, arrives and shoots Kiryu in the chest and leg from the rooftop. Tachibana grabs Kiryu and they run for cover. Then, in what is an incredibly unnecessary moment, Laogwei dives, flips, and acrobats his way down the building. It's absurd. This doesn't say intimidating bad guy, it says the world of Yakuza operates on Looney Tunes logic and we shouldn't take anything seriously. Tachibana agrees to leave with Laogwei if he spares Kiryu, which he does. Kiryu wakes up 3 hours later, bandaged and in the care of Elder Chen, Little Asia's representative. Knowing that Tachibana will most likely be tortured for information, Kiryu departs Little Asia and is immediately accosted by Dojima family thugs. Nishiki is present and turns his back on them, deciding that he'd rather go down fighting with Kiryu. They successfully defeat them and then go rescue Tachibana, but they're too late. Tachibana is mortally wounded and can barely speak by the time Kiryu arrives. Nishiki retrieves Makoto, but Tachibana dies before she can reunite with him. And goddamn is this scene tear-jerking, the highlight being Makoto's voice actor, who absolutely kills it. A story can lose the viewer when it feels overly convenient. This often happens due to an overabundance of coincidences. I'm not against coincidences altogether, as they do happen in real life. In Yakuza's case, despite the sometimes cheesy antics, the story feels very human and real. Having a single coincidence wouldn't have been too bad. But the amount of coincidences and flawed logic in the link between Tachibana and Makoto is too much. First, Tachibana is after the empty lot, and it just so happens that its owner is also his sister. As if that weren't enough, Oda is both Tachibana's right-hand man and by happenstance also the person who sold Makoto to the Korean mafia. And the fact that they're siblings brings up other questions I fear have no answer. Shouldn't Tachibana also have inherited the empty lot as a joint owner since they're related? And why did he never contact his grandfather or vice versa? After arriving in Kamurocho while searching for Makoto, Majima and Sagawa are taken to their boss Shimano. It's here that Shimano reveals his master plan. He didn't want Makoto killed and intentionally chose Majima as the hitman because he knew he wouldn't be able to go through with it. He predicted that Makoto would therefore trust Majima and do whatever he told her, including selling the empty lot to him, and that he also wanted to ferret out his enemies like the Nikyo Consortium. Absolute, insane nonsense. Let's examine this plan in detail. First, the only part of this plan that does make sense is ferreting out enemies like Sarah and the Nikyo Consortium. Now, I don't doubt Shimano's claim that he knows Majima better than he knows himself. He did keep the guy locked up and tortured for a year. But what if he miscalculated and Majima actually went through with it? And by passing the order to him through Sagawa instead of contacting Majima directly, Sagawa, who has no qualms about killing Makoto, winds up getting involved. If Sarah had shown up 30 seconds later, he would have killed her. And the claim that a person would trust a hitman sent to kill them who couldn't go through with it more than anyone else is also crazy. I don't know about you, but I would have no trust in that person because they made the decision emotionally and could just as easily change their mind. Surely someone sent specifically to safeguard you would be more trustworthy. And by keeping all of this secret, Shimano's forces only amount to 2 people, Majima and Sagawa, who have to go up against scores of Dojima family operatives and the Kaijin clan. Why did Shimano need Makoto to trust someone anyway? If Shimano's goal was to acquire the empty lot, the best move would have been to send as much muscle as possible to safeguard her and then coerce the deed out of her later. It feels like the game is pulling a plot twist just for the sake of having one. But for every logically dumb thing that happens, something else emotionally powerful happens. Makoto is a masterclass at how to write a sympathetic character. She's blind, the Yakuza are trying to kidnap or kill her, and the people trying to help her get injured or die. She was traumatized and abused after being sold to human traffickers. Later she talks about her childhood growing up in China, suffering from discrimination as a mixed-race person. Her older brother flees the country when she's 10 years old, abandoning her. When she and her mother reunite with her Japanese grandfather, the language barrier makes it so they can't communicate. Then her mother commits suicide. Even her favorite watch is broken. The game is trying so hard to make you feel sympathy for her, and it 100% works. But why does it work? A story pushing so much misfortune onto a character would normally feel contrived and emotionally manipulative, so why does it work with Makoto? I think it's because of 3 things. Number 1, agency. Number 2, empathy. And number 3, humanity. Let's start with agency. While she does fit the typical mold of a damsel in distress, Makoto is assertive and takes an active role in her life and the events around her. She needs help, but she's not helpless, an important distinction. We see this in the very first encounter with her when she bumps into Majima. Does she cower in fear? No. She starts screaming that he's a thief to try and attract attention. She's always asking questions about what's going on and trying to play an active role in her own fate. When Oda takes her hostage, she pulls a knife and stabs him in the leg. Kiryu isn't the one to save her alone. She saves herself even if she still needs his help. When Sarah and later Kiryu act as her guardians, she doesn't just go along with whatever they want. She consciously makes the decision to follow their plan after hearing them out and determines on her own to meet with Tachibana. Next, there's empathy. Despite suffering through so much abuse, the first time we meet her at the massage clinic after the initial confrontation with Majima, she's smiling and conversing jovially, talking about how she enjoys her work and likes speaking with people. She seems to have an unexpectedly positive, optimistic outlook on life, seemingly uncharacteristic of someone with her tragic background. She sees the good in others and wants to help them even if they don't deserve it. She's not immune to tragedy, she simply chooses to make the best of her situation. She has Lee helping her get information on the man with the bat tattoo, but she isn't seeking revenge, she just wants to prevent anyone else from going through what she did. When Oda is injured and decides to stay behind, sacrificing himself so she and Kiryu can get away, she's against it and wants to take him with them. This is despite the fact that he was the one who sold her into slavery. This is right after he just got done holding her hostage and explaining that his plan was to murder her, yet she's apparently ready to forgive him. And lastly, humanity. Makoto doesn't feel like a character written to engender sympathy, even though that's what she is. She feels like a real person with flaws and weaknesses. When she's in the warehouse and Majima is probing her backstory, she tells him to go ask Lee instead. Lee remarks that she could have told Majima everything, but she doesn't like to talk about it. A lesser story would have simply had her explain her backstory right then and there, but Yakuza is smarter than that. In real life, it's painful to recount events of suffering and abuse. When her brother dies, her whole demeanor changes and she starts pursuing revenge. She foolishly ignores Majima's advice and sets out on her own. And when she realizes too late that her plan won't work and gets shot by the Yakuza, does she have some last-minute witty remark or vengeful bluster? No, she lays on the ground crying and feeling sorry for herself. Makoto is a fully realized character and the linchpin around whom the entire story turns, and she's more important to it than Kiryu or Majima. Now we come to the climax, and the game suddenly realizes that we know next to nothing about our final antagonist, Shibusawa. He spontaneously begins delivering exposition regarding his childhood, the death of his father, his pursuit of glory, and so on. I guess it's nice that we're finally getting something, but this needed to be delivered much earlier, sprinkled throughout the game like how Kuze and Iwano were, not introduced right before the final battle. Of course, Kiryu wins the fight, but before he can deliver the finishing blow, Nishiki stays his hand and starts sermonizing about not crossing the moral boundary of murder. Before I talk about how ridiculous this is, I first need to bring up ludonarrative dissonance, which is a fancy term game critics use to sound smart. It really just boils down to inconsistency in a story, when what you're shown doesn't match what you do or what you're told. Plot holes, contradictions, flawed logic, and so forth. Yakuza 0 unfortunately has these issues in spades. They're so rampant throughout the game that I'll argue the developers' intentions are that you ignore them. What you do in the game's side content, from running around the city to playing minigames to doing side stories, not only doesn't match the main plot, it actively contradicts it. So you have this ticking clock element. Kiryu has enemies within the Yakuza bearing down on him, and he needs to solve the murder he's been framed for quickly. Majima has a ton of pressure from the higher-ups to locate and kill Makoto, and then gets into a race against time protecting her. So clearly there's some serious business to deal with and not a lot of time to do it. Except as Majima, you can leave Makoto in a dusty warehouse for hours while you go play dress-up with cabaret girls, or wander the streets of Kamurocho as Kiryu helping random strangers with their punk rock personas. or relax at the local billiards club, or spend hours winning plushies from the claw machine, and on and on and on. The residents of West Park are all homeless, except they apparently have limitless cash to burn in various gambling minigames. The underground criminal gladiator coliseum remains a highly secret enterprise, yet also has hundreds of people in the audience who never speak of it to outsiders. Even if you ignore the side activities, the actual narratives in the side content contradict the main plot. In Chapter 10, Kiryu has to hide in West Park with a homeless man he met earlier. This makes sense. The Yakuza are after him and they burn down his apartment. Kiryu has nowhere else to go. But that's main story Kiryu. Side story Kiryu is a multi-billionaire real estate mogul with a vast network of subordinates and a personal office building. Heck, every time someone brings up how the empty lot is worth 1 billion yen reminds me of how I can make more than 1 billion yen in 5 minutes fighting Mr. Shakedown. But to be fair, Yakuza 0 isn't trying to be a complicated, choice-based game like Disco Elysium or Mass Effect. The main story is self-contained and isolated from anything else you might do in the game. So while I found the idea that Kiryu had nowhere else to stay a bit jarring, I was willing to let it go and fully commit to the idea that the side content is completely separate with no bearing on the main story. But the main story also contradicts itself. I don't take issue with most minor problems or nitpicks. So for example, it doesn't bother me that Kiryu's suit becomes gross and dirty when he fights Kuze in the sewers, only for it to be back to normal in the next scene. I didn't even notice that on my first playthrough. Likewise, it's not a problem for me that the trunk of this car gets shot up but the bullet holes are gone in the next scene. What I do take issue with is when flawed logic and contradictions lessen the emotional impact and meaning of a story and its characters. When Kiryu and Tachibana flee Little Asia, the assassin Laogui shoots Kiryu in the chest and leg. He's shown 3 hours later laying in bed, bandaged. Then he's able to immediately fight a group of Yakuza thugs at full strength. He even rips off his suit and the bandages are gone. He doesn't even have any wounds. A character dramatically ripping off their suit in a single motion as though it were made of tearaway fabric to reveal a muscular, tattooed body underneath is something that happens many times in the story. Those moments were cheesy, awesome, and always brought a smile to my face. It doesn't make sense, but it doesn't need to because it doesn't matter to the plot how quickly a character can disrobe. But how are we supposed to take the story seriously or care about the stakes when characters can completely heal and recover from multiple gunshot wounds in a few hours? Now, maybe you could argue that Yakuza 0 operates on flawed action movie logic, where Kiryu and Majima have ridiculous fortitude, able to single-handedly take on legions of men and come out the other side unscathed. I'd still have an issue with that, but okay, I'll roll with it. Except later on, Majima gets punched repeatedly in the face by a group of punks, and in subsequent scenes his face is still bruised. A big part of the story is the idea that the protagonists have not and should not kill anyone, that doing so crosses a moral line which shouldn't be crossed. It's the case for both leads, but especially Kiryu. Yet there are multiple examples in the main story of Kiryu clearly killing people. Let's leave aside any combat gameplay where you can brutally stomp, stab, and shoot enemies, and only include scripted events and cutscenes. Kiryu kicks this guy out of a multi-story window to his death, although he does show up later somehow miraculously alive. During the high-speed car chase in Chapter 13, Kiryu shoots and kills 40 men. No, that's not an exaggeration, I counted. He's shooting them in the head and their cars are catching fire, flipping over and exploding. They dead. Now let's talk more about that highway chase. At one point, the Yakuza show up in a helicopter and start firing a bazooka at Kiryu's car. The missiles travel slow enough that he's actually able to shoot them out of the air. But it doesn't matter because even if you miss a few rockets, the car taking a direct hit from an RPG doesn't hinder it in the slightest. Is it a problem that you can shoot missiles out of the air? No, because it's a necessary compromise between realism and gameplay to make the set piece work, like how the handgun Kiryu uses has infinite ammo. Is it a big problem that Kiryu has clearly killed people but the story insists he hasn't? Yes, because it undermines the themes and characters. These and other problems I've mentioned are what I mean by Yakuza 0 being messy. It's a great story, but it has its issues. However, while the logic and events are sometimes flawed, they still work emotionally, which is the most important thing. In one of the game's final scenes, Makoto, now able to see again, is harassed by 2 Yakuza in the street. Majima steps in and slugs them, then stares at her. A male doctor comes running, and Majima takes him aside to ask him if he loves her. He replies that he does, and Majima tells him that he should be more forward and to get on with it. As Majima goes on his way, Makoto remarks that he looks sad before the scene fades to credits. Meanwhile, I'm scratching my head wondering how in the world she doesn't recognize him. He intentionally doesn't speak in front of her so she won't recognize his voice, but come on! She knows he's a Yakuza with an eye patch, then one shows up in front of her and she can't put 2 and 2 together? Now, I've analyzed this scene with a team of scientists, and we've determined that one of 3 things is going on. 1. Yakuza with eye patches are actually incredibly common despite Majima being the only one we see in the game. 2. The bullet that hit Makoto struck her right in the IQ. Or 3. The story once again puts emotion before logic. It's bizarre and slightly sours what could have been the end of the game. Thankfully, there's one more scene to go, and it's the best in the whole story. Before we get there, during the credits, we're shown stills that describe events which happen in future Yakuza games. I think these are supposed to act as teasers for people who haven't played them or nostalgia bait for those who have. Regardless, I don't think they work either way. They take the relatively happy ending of the game and mar it with a bunch of spoilers for tragic events to come. While the focus of this video is Yakuza 0, I do want to briefly mention its sequels. When I finished the game, I was excited to play the other games in the series and immediately purchased Yakuza Kiwami 1 and 2. While I may make a video about them in the future, what I can say for now is they were massively disappointing and killed my enthusiasm for the rest of the franchise. I can't speak about the other games since I haven't played them, but the footage I've seen hasn't convinced me to, except for maybe the recent Yakuza 7, which I'll likely try out. A final post-credit scene shows Makoto returning to the empty lot where her brother died and praying, when she's interrupted by the sound of her old watch's music, buried nearby presumably by Majima. Fun fact, there are only 3 times I've teared up watching a story in my life. One was at the end of Fullmetal Alchemist, the second was the Superman scene in The Iron Giant, and the third was the final scene of Yakuza 0. The game briefly continues, showing a chance encounter between Kiryu and Majima, the only time in the story the two have met. Thought it was weird my first time playing, but I guess it's supposed to be a little fan service tease for longtime players of the franchise. Personally, I would have preferred if the game had concluded on Makoto's scene. Regardless, Yakuza 0's story is amazing. It's not perfect, it has its flaws, but it's emotionally gripping and left me feeling satisfied. When it finally ended, I just sat back and soaked it all in. It's an epic 100-hour tale that incorporates action, comedy, and drama, and a brilliantly balanced dance.